record. Good morning, dearest friends. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today, Monday, March 7th. What are we, the 4th of Adar? Is that it? The 4th of Adar base. We're on the march, just 11 days away from Purim, already in a time that should be full of optimism and hope. And let's hope and be optimistic and send our good wishes and blessings and tefillot for those who need protection, security, and to need to escape. It should be without a hitch, as much as spending multiple days to escape across many borders with nothing but the clothing on your back is considered without a hitch. But let's pray that it should all go as smooth as possible. We also dedicate our learning to the dear, wonderful members of this Chabura and their households, those on the front of the camera, behind the camera. And I want to mention Leah Basrita, Malka Basrifka, and hold on, I got another name, but I'm now forgetting. So if I remember, I'll mention it later on. And the main thing is we should have an abundance of good news and healthy news and happy news. And,
Amen.
and that's it. That's what we need. We're studying Masechet Shabbos. I didn't say this in the beginning. Chapter 13. We are on Kuf Vav Amud Beis 106b. And yes, we're studying the entire Talmud, one page, one line, maybe even a few letters at a time. And again, Shabbos 13, page 106b. And we're talking about trapping. Trapping, as we know, is one of the 39 malachis, one of the 39 steps that were necessary for the construction of the Mishkan. How so? Well, there were a number of skins and pigments that entailed trapping, catching, and therefore we do not trap or catch on Shabbos. And we've been discussing precisely when an animal is classified as trapped. And so to discuss that, we had to talk exhaustively and extensively about the definition of a bivar and different kinds of animals and different kinds of environments that an animal may or may not be considered in custody, if you will. I'll share the screen. I'm going to give one slight possible correction to something that I said on Friday, and then we will continue. So we studied a Mishnah that had a few opinions about when an animal is considered trapped and when an animal is considered not trapped. And Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel taught that not every bivar, not every enclosure is the same. Depends on the size, the ability to catch it. And we had a discussion if that is identical to what Rabbi Yehuda says, which he essentially says, he makes a similar distinction. And so the Gemara ends off saying, Gemara Zemor Tetehe, which I said was a refute saying that, or retort saying that it's not plausible that Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Gamliel would say the same thing. After examining some of the other commentaries and translations and the like, it seems like he's saying, okay, it's not implausible that there could be the structure of the Mishnah for additional purposes. Study it and figure out what it is, but it's plausible that the distinction is not entirely or explicitly halachic. So I may have explained that wrong. I struggle a little bit with this Gemara, but that is that. All right, we're going to continue talking about trapping. And before we close out the unit on trapping, I want to discuss practically, just again, not halacha lemaisa, but I want to sample the halachic discussion about when trapping is biblical, when trapping might be more of a rabbinic matter, and it will have to do with some of the ideas that we've been discussing. But for now, we're going to go to another brisa that talks about other factors of if an animal is considered trapped or not. Namely, what if it is a vulnerable animal? What if it is an immobile animal? By catching it, have you trapped it, or is it already essentially? So let's see. Tana Rabbanan, a brisa that says, Hasod Tzvi Suma V'Yashan, one who traps and I usually translate Tzvi as deer. Someone here translated Tzvi as gazelle, but anyways, if you trap a deer that is Suma, blind, V'Yashan, or asleep, Chayav, you are liable because what you've done is essentially trapped a sleeping deer. Vizakin, what if it is Chigar, if it is lame, Vizakin, or not, or feeble due to advanced age, V'choyle, or sick, Hatar, one is exempt. So we essentially have animals that have different handicaps, if you will, conditions that slow down or otherwise restrict their mobility. Being blind is a big problem for mobility. Sleeping is a problem for mobility. It's hard to run away from someone or something when you're asleep. Being lame restricts mobility. Weak from age restricts mobility, and being sickly restricts mobility. Sleeping and blind, one is chayiv. The other three, pater. Amarli Abaya le Rav Yosef. So Abaya asks Rav Yosef a good question. Why does the Brisa, why do we halachically differentiate between the first two items and the last three items? Surely they all are similar in that the animal's mobility is restricted or otherwise not going to happen. The animal's more or less stuck in one place. So the Gemara answers, Hani Avidi Lir Rabuye. Rashi, Lishamet Kishimar Gishim Yadadam. An animal could be blind, but it has very good instincts. As we know, animals depend on humans too, depend on other instincts, other ways to gather information and to protect themselves aside for sight. And so just because the animal is asleep, it doesn't mean that it has a very delicate sensor. It senses when someone's creeping up on it and it can immediately run away. And even a blind animal, and maybe most specifically a blind animal, has the ability to perceive has other ways to pick up on a menace, someone that's coming to trap it. So just because the animal is asleep or blind, that does not mean that you are going to easily be able to seize it, as opposed to the other three conditions, which are restrictions on the animal's ability to be mobile. Well, then they cannot slip away because they do not have the physical or medical capacity to do so. So that is an attempt to explain. Problem is, there's a brisa that indicates a little differently. Tanya, there's another brisa that says that trapping a sickly animal, you're chayiv. So are you chayiv for trapping a sick animal or pater? And of course, the Gemara is going to give an answer that's going to sound very right and reasonable to us. Amar Rav Sheshes. Rav Sheshes says it's a simple distinction. Loi kasha habechoila machmas ishasa. If the animal has a fever, I guess it is still capable of escaping. Habechoila machmas uvtsana. But there are other kinds of illnesses that are fatigue. Rashi, ayefut. Sometimes an animal becomes lethargic in illness. Well, then the animal cannot escape. But if the animal simply has a malady that does not immediately affect its mobility, well, then the animal can escape nonetheless. Now, you're wondering the question that I'm wondering, how do you know if the animal is sick? Do you take its temperature before trapping it? So, but I guess that's the point. If the animal essentially looks as healthy as ever, well, then you've trapped it, you're chayiv. If the animal is caught because it's incapable of escaping, well, maybe that by definition is the greatest evidence that the animal is sick in a way that is pater. Reb Beryl, yes.
Normally, what would happen is you trap the animal and then you found out it was sick.
Right. That's what I said. That's my point.
So,
no, I'll tell you this. You can see an animal if you're a trapper, and again, I have to admit, I've never gone hunting.
Neither have I. If I trapped it, for sure it's sick or in a coma.
Exactly. But so I was going to say, those that are experts at trapping can probably sense when an animal is reacting within its ideal nature, when an animal is sickly and vulnerable. Now, in the wild, many times carnivorous creatures that prey on other living creatures will dafka seek out the vulnerable. They're an easier prey. I suspect humans that are hunting for the thrill of the challenge would dafka be not very eager to trap a sickly animal, aside for the fact that probably a sick animal may not be as healthy to consume. I'm imagining. But anyways, here the question is simply, is the animal essentially already presented to you on a silver platter? Like Reb Beryl said, the only way you and I are going to catch an animal is if it's God forbid, in a coma or otherwise entirely immobile. And that's the point. An animal that is unfortunately so sick that it cannot run, you're not trapping it. It's there. But an animal that has a fever, that has some kind of illness, but it's entirely on the ball as ever, well, then that animal is free, and trapping it would be chayiv. And so the point simply is, I don't think the Gemara is actually saying take its temperature and decide if you could trap it. I think the Gemara is saying with the observation, you can figure out very easily if the animal is halachically free, or if the animal is halachically as good as trapped. That's what I believe we are saying here. Make sense? You're not So again, animal. So the Gemara here introduces two important principles. Lack of visibility or the ability to see as an animal does not mean the animal is immobile. Animals rely on other senses, certainly for short-term escape. Sleeping as well. Animals can be woken very easily, and therefore they are considered free, not trapped, and they need to be trapped.
Rabbi, why would somebody want to trap an animal on a Shabbos when he can lay the trap out during the week? And
we're not talking about laying traps. We're talking about trapping. You can ask them anything. Why would a person build on Shabbos? They can build during the week. Why would a person cook on Shabbos? That's a good question. But here we're talking about if it's prohibited, not why you would do it.
Well, building, you've got a certain time to finish the building.
On the contrary, Alan, respectfully, building, you probably have the supplies and you can do it whenever you want. Trapping, you kind of have to seize the moment. So I can make the case that trap. But anyways, the bottom line is our Gemara is not asking the question of why a person is doing it. The Gemara is identifying things which are permitted and prohibited to be done on Shabbos. And that is the essence of our discussion here. Is behavior X considered an act of trapping? Yes or no? That's the Gemara's question. And we're going through a variety of scenarios. Some are trapping, some are not trapping. And that is the story. Let's now continue.
Are we dealing here in Shogeg or Mezid?
Both. Now we're talking about the defining prohibited acts on Shabbos. Those acts on Shabbos, if they're done unintentionally with the lack of awareness. Hold on, I'm sorry, give me 1 second. Sorry, 1 second. Sorry, 1 second. All right. I'm sorry. I'm back with you. What was that? Was there a question outstanding? All right. Let's now transition for a moment from trapping animals, livestock, game for human consumption. And that's why you'll notice the presumption we've been talking about trapping here was about a deer. Why a deer? Well, because domestic animals don't need to be trapped. They're already in your custody. There are other restrictions but you're not trapping them. They're already trapped. So I guess the most prevalent kosher animal that's being trapped is a deer. But let's not. So that's for meat. You trap it, you bring it to the ch13 and you shecht it. Ostensibly, we're talking about a kosher. We're talking about a person that probably wants to keep kosher. Of course, it could extend to other animals as well. I'm not saying it only applies to a deer. I'm just saying maybe that's why the prime example is going to be a deer. Now let's talk about other critters on Shabbos. Taner Rabbanan. And we may come across something that will sound a bit surprising, but let's not jump the gun and let's remind ourselves that we are not entirely halacha l'maisa till we finish the Gemara and then take a look in the Shulchan Aruch. Taner Rabbanan. Ebraisa. Hatzad chagavim, a trapper who's trapping locusts. Gazin, Rabbi Steinzal say cicadas, Sira'in, hornets, Vietushin, and mosquitoes, Bashabas. You trap all these insects. Chayev, the Brisa says one is liable for trapping. Divi Rabbi Meir, this is the teaching, the opinion of Rabbi Meir. What kind of chagav are we talking about? Oh, I'm sorry, no. Chagavim and interesting. There's a machlokes, Rashi, and Rabbi Steinsaltz. If you'll indulge me for a moment. Chagavim, we know are grasshoppers or locusts. What are gazim? So Rabbi Steinsaltz says cicadas. Are cicadas kosher? I hope not. I hope not.
I don't even know what it is.
But Beryl, you don't know what a cicada is? You must not live in the DC area. Professor Stern, have you ever seen a cicada? No?
I've
don't
seen
think any-
cicadas,
No
and
Boston.
You can certainly hear them.
In the tri-state area, I know they have it. In the DC area, I know they have them.
Barely
but-
you know what they are. They're the ones that go in the heat.
Hold on, Rabbi Nachman. Again, I'm a Florida. If I'm not mistaken, cicadas are the kinds of insects that mostly live underground, and there's different cycles. But every X number of years, they come up to the surface, they mate, they lay their eggs, and then they all die. And so you can see a whole lot of.
yeah, they're all over the place.
You just find them dead all over the place. And there's always articles. There was a big swarm last year. And so there are articles about taking them and making them into protein powder. And it would be a good substitute for everything under the sun.
They love Teaneck. They love to come to Teaneck.
They love Teaneck. They must love
Yeah.
the kosher. They must love the kosher restaurants and the shuls.
Right, exactly.
So anyways, so Rabbi Steinsaltz says that gazin are locusts. Rashi disagrees. He says min chagav taharu v'nechalim. It is a edible kosher grasshopper, which I do not believe that describes a cicada. So we have a little machlokes going on over here, which probably points to a broader or a general machlokes about the identity of this animal. Again, I'm not sure if it's super interesting, but no. Anyways, elsewhere there's discussion. Let's see if the Meiri talks about. No, it's an earlier text. Okay, so here we have it. A bunch of insects. You trap them. Chayiv. Divrei Rabbi Meir. This is the viewpoint of Rabbi Meir that you're not allowed to trap these animals. The Chachamim Oimrim. The Chachamim.
What makes a locust kosher?
The Torah
Are there
describes.
signs, or is it just, we know that locusts are kosher? But
No.
there are probably different subdivisions of locusts. So what makes
In
a
the-
specific one?
In the Torah, there are species or a genus of locusts that are kosher and types that are not. It has to do with the number and, the layout of there are biological indicators if they are kosher or not. Now, you may notice that Ashkenazic Jews you'll never go to a Kiddush or a Shabbat Brachis or a Vart or a Bris and have, toasted or roasted grasshoppers.
But the Yemenites eat it.
The Yemenite Jews and other communities may have consumed them until recent and perhaps to this day. The
They still do.
reason why Ashkenazic Jews do not serve toasted or pickled locusts, even that are kosher, is because we do not have a Mesorah of the identity. And in Jewish law, kosher is very much Mesorah oriented. Mesorah means a tradition. So if we have a tradition going back to the previous generations, this is a similar issue regarding certain kinds of birds. Well, about birds as well. Is there a tradition about the kosher status of the locusts? Now is it Rabbi Slifkin, who's very into studying these things, and I think he once organized a biblical feast or a meal of some fundraiser. I think it was in Teaneck.
Yes.
Considered controversial. I'm not going to ask you. I'm not sure if all the Rabbanim were in favor, and so he served a number of dishes that would not be. Well, as I said, you wouldn't find it at your average bris or upsharon or Shabbat brachas. And so anyways, but suffice it to say, once upon a time, Jews may have been allowed to eat it. And you know what? Certain regions, they may have needed locusts at certain times to survive. So, anyways, I'm not going to judge those that ate locusts. I don't find it or imagine it to be very, very appetizing, but I guess I've been conditioned to see it that way, and maybe others see it differently. Anyways, Divrei Rabbi Meir. This is the viewpoint of Rabbi Meir. You're not allowed to trap these items, and if you do, this is a Shabbos problem. Chachamim, the Chachamim say no, and they give us an interesting general principle. Kol shebeminoi nitzaid, an animal which typically is the subject of a hunt or trapping. Now, listen carefully, because we're going to be forced to do some thinking. If it is conventionally, typically trapped, chayiv, one is liable. But if it is not a type of creature that is trapped, pater, one is exempt. Let's read Rashi, and then we'll talk about what it means. Rashi says kosher critters. Rashi's of the opinion that gazim are kosher. Chagavim, we're talking about kosher critters. They're able to be eaten, and so they are typically trapped. And why are they trapped? For consumption. So you're chayiv because you're trapping something that is typically trapped, not to avoid, not to escape, not to get rid of them, but because you are hungry, you want a snack. Or other animals perhaps are trapped not for their meat, but they're trapped for their skin or for other utility. If an animal is trapped for a proactive, for the desire of that animal, well, then you're chayiv. But animals that are not otherwise trapped for what they have to offer, for example, sirin, how do you call it? Hornets, mosquitoes, you have nothing constructive from them. A person may trap mosquitoes because they don't want to be bit. You may trap hornets because you don't want hornets to bite you. But once you've trapped them, there's not much you want to do with them. There is no mosquito salad or hornet soup, to my knowledge. I may be wrong. And so therefore, there's nothing constructive from them. Now, today, I know the scientists, you may have a scientist that actually wants to have a hornet to study or whatever. And maybe, well, anyways, let's see the Gemara. But that's the point the Gemara makes. If it's typically trapped, the Chachamim say you may trap it, you may not trap it rather. And if it's typically not trapped, then this is not considered Seidah. That's one brisa. Tanya Idach, there's another brisa that says Hatzod Chagavim Mishas Hatal. If you trap a grasshopper when there is dew, what's the problem with dew? Apparently, they become blind when there is dew. Rashi says, "Einehem mitavrot." They become blind and paralyzed. V'harehein nitzudin v'oimden. They are trapped by the dew. Potter. One is exempt because you have not done an act of trapping. B'shas hashara. But if you trap it in the time of great blazing sun, chayiv, one is chayiv. Lazar ben Mahavai Omer. Lazar of Havai says, Im hayu mekalchoi subais pater. If there were in a swarm, Dr. Stamler, what is the word kiluach? Miklachat.
Stream.
A stream, a shower. So we're talking about a very high concentration of how do you call it, locusts. They are so accessible. You just stick your hand out in the air and you're going to end up having a locust in your hand. So he says, Potter.
I don't know, just because they're accessible, you're still entrapping them, you're still catching them. So I don't understand why it's patur. It's still tzeda. Just because they're more accessible, whether they become blinded by the dew, or there's a large number of them, and all you have to do is put out your hand, you're still depriving them by your act of freedom. So it's still Seder.
So I suppose it's the concept, the halachic idea of Seder is taking an entirely free and escaped, free-flying critter and taking it into custody. If it is already in handcuffs, if it is already paralyzed, if it is already immobile, and even as you stretch to take it, it cannot escape you. It seems from our Gemara, at least according to some, according to the Raisa, according to Rabbi Elazar ben Mavai, that it is considered lacking mobility, lacking freedom, and in the moment it's not considered trapped. It's essentially waltzed into your hand. I hear your point, but in the halachic definition of trapping, it is not considered trapped. Rebero, yes.
There's something else that occurs to me, that you have no use for it. If you have mosquitoes in your house, you trap them and you get them out of your house, you've accomplished something.
So do you remember our discussion about sricha legufa and not? The idea is the melacha, according to most or some, has to be a proactive, positive, constructive. A melacha needs to be constructive. So if you're trapping something that you want to eat or serve your guests or sell on eBay, that's constructive. And the lens to define if it is constructively trapped or not is if civilization traps it and sells it. And that for that reason, there may be some variation between regions. But the point we're making here is that to trap, and we'll see this more accentuated later, which is why I don't want to spend too much time now. It's one of the items that I told you in my intro that we'll take a look in the Shulchan Aruch when we finish. But if something has no constructive value and your whole relationship is removing them, that might not be considered a constructive malacha to be biblically prohibited. Now, that doesn't mean you could do it, because as we know, many times after we define the biblical parameters, there are additional rabbinic restrictions. But as far as a biblical prohibition, at least some of the opinions cited here are that is not considered trapping. Now, just again, real fast. Rabbi Meir says it, you're chayiv, even though they are not typically trapped. Chachamim, and the point that we're discussing in this moment, says, listen, if you don't want it, if you don't need it, all you want is to get rid of it, it might not be considered. You might even call this loy nichale. He doesn't want to have bugs all over his house, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Now the Gemara asks a question. Elazar ben Mavai, when he says Im hayu mekalchotu ba'ot, they're streaming, what is he talking about? Is he talking about if there is dew in their eyes, or is he talking about the time of great heat? So you can have a swarm that's incapacitated, and you can also have a swarm that's flying. And Rabbi Menachem asked, hold on, just because I could catch a single grasshopper or locust, but they are all still entirely free. So Gemara asks, when he talks about the swarm, he's talking about a time of great mobility or great incapacitation. Tashlemas. So now the Gemara is going to bring a brisa, another brisa, to hopefully fill in the blanks. Trap a locust when it is dewy. Potter. One is exempt. B'shas hasharav, in the time of great sun, chayiv. Again, this is familiar. Elazar ben Mavai says, afilu b'shas hasharav, even when it's very, very hot and sunny, and the locusts are in their most maximum optimal functionality. If they were coming in streams, great accessibility, potter, one is yet potter. Now Rabbi Menachem, you asked I don't know if you see it, Rabbi Menachem, you here? You asked a good question, which is what exactly is it about? Yeah, you asked a good question. What does it mean? Why is it that just because there's a vast horde of locusts, it's not considered trapping? What about this is by definition not trapping? So I don't know. I'm just trying to think. I'm wondering if anyone has any thoughts to share. I guess.
What if you trap a bee to keep it out of trouble, and then you let it go?
So that was like what Reb Beryl asked. Let's hold off just for a moment because we're going to get there soon. But I want to understand about this mikalchot. Why is that not considered trapping? I'm not seeing any major. All right, I don't know. I imagine what I imagine, and Rabbi Nachman, I'm not. We have to think this through some more. I imagine, in a sense, there's a degree of certain animals. You're trapping the individual, like a deer. You're like targeting a specific deer. I imagine when you're trapping locusts, you take what you can get, and so in a swarm where there's little effort needed, although ultimately each individual locust, we could say, is free and mobile, but as a species, it is vulnerable to the point where you do not need to expend effort to trap it. I imagine that's how we're going to have to look at it. But it's a good question, worthy of some follow-up. This is our Gemara talking about insects and asserting a series of opinions, because there's two primary issues. Accessibility, is it trapped or not? That was what came up primarily in the locust. And then, do you want it or not? And that's where the big question or the big machlokes between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim about critters that you do not intend to trap. Let's go to the Shulchan Aruch. I'm debating if this is premature. Let's go to the Shulchan Aruch now. I know we're missing most of our crowd here. Let's take a look. This very halacha in the Code of Jewish Law. Let's just go a little. Let's go to the top here. No, we did this last time. Here. Sad Suvi Yashan Oisuma. If you trap a sleeping or blind deer, chayav, when it's liable. But if it is sickly, weak, ill, old, pater. Then the Rama adds, if you sick a dog after the animal on Shabbos, that's considered trapping. And then he adds, and the Rama adds a very interesting, and he condemns essentially the act of trapping. Now we know nobility, Polish, Ukrainian nobility, I'm sure elsewhere as well, but in the Jewish tradition, that was what the Rama was exposed to. So nobility would go hunting, and it was a whole ritual with dogs or falcons or both. And so he says on Shabbos, you're not allowed to do that. And then he adds, based on the Gemara, that even in the weekday, this is not considered constructive behavior. Very interesting. So there you get a little criticism by a great Polish sage, the Rama, lived in Krakow, and it sounds like there's some criticism against the culture of the elites of hunting, which is again an interesting, very interesting to note. But now to our point: Kol shebeminoi nitzoid, a critter which its species is subject to trapping, chayiv alav, it's considered trapping, and you're chayiv. Ein b'minoi nitzoid, but if the species, is not subject to trapping, typically patur, one would be exempt biblically, aval asor, but one mustn't do so. Oh, hilkach, therefore, zevuvim, flies. Although people do not trap flies because they want to have flies, they do trap flies to get rid of them. Also, then one oughtn't to trap a fly. So flies can be annoying, but in Shabbos, Jewish law precludes trapping flies. Interesting. The Rama adds, therefore, one should be mindful. To not close a small box, a listim kalim, or to seal a dish, If there are flies flying around Shabbos, they have a psikresha because you're in a sense absolutely trapping them. Others say, listen, if it happened along the way, they'll escape your pot. Which again tells us probably a little bit of a perspective about the sanitary conditions of life that consider that every time you close a dish, most likely you're trapping a fly in there. Another reason why we have a lot to be grateful. Continuing just a bit further. No, we'll stop here for now. I want to read for you an excerpt from on this same subject. Let me see something. Here. If you trap snakes, scorpions, or other dangerous, hazardous, harmful creatures, if you're trapping it because some antidotes to poison is other kinds of poison, so it's a remedy, you're chayiv. But if you're trapping the scorpion or the snake so that you do not get bitten, you do not be harmed by it, mutar. Shulchan Aruch says one is allowed to trap an extremely hazardous critter. So, you see a snake, Florida, or Florida, we don't have scorpions. But I know when I was in Israel, there are scorpions, and elsewhere in America, you can have scorpions. Well, if they are dangerous, you can trap them. The question becomes, what about mosquitoes or other kinds of animals which are annoying and painful, but not dangerous? And so there's a lot of discussion on the matter. Excuse me. So basically, it seems that looking at the Shulchan Aruch Harav, the work of the Alter Rebbe, the Baal Tanya, a species that's deadly, even if you have another kind that's not dangerous, one might get away with trapping it on Shabbos. One might be allowed to trap them. And it's not considered a malacha tzricha legufa. It's not considered because you don't want the animal. You want to avoid it. But one should not trap animals that are simply a nuisance.
I have a question.
Yes.
So what happens if someone doesn't know if a mosquito is dangerous for you or not dangerous for you? How would you know to trap it or not trap it?
Well, are
Someone is not knowledgeable of these animals or if anything like that, to trap it or not.
Well, I'll tell you this. Unfortunately, if you've lived in New York or Florida for more than a few months, you've probably encountered a mosquito. You've probably been bitten. And most likely, you've discovered if it's fatal or not. But there are other bugs that you are correct. So let's say hornets or bees, or what if a person is allergic to bees? And so, again, this is not a halacha lemaisa, but animals that are considered to be hazardous, not just annoying, one may trap. The question with bees particularly are, even if it is hazardous, it's not always the best thing to go after the bees to hunt them. Sometimes the best thing is to, maybe move away and try to move inside. But if you're going to go after them to hunt them, the odds are that probably higher that a person will end up being stung. And if a person is allergic, they should make sure to have an EpiPen. But perhaps if they are dangerous to an individual, or you're not sure, killer hornets, well, then it sounds like you would certainly be allowed to trap them on Shabbos. Actually, here.
What is trapping, Rabbi? What does trapping mean? Does it mean killing?
So you're asking a good question.
After you trap it, or does it mean letting it go after you trap it?
You trap it with a cup. They get it with a cup. You're going to actually lose oxygen.
So actually, you're right. There's going to be a discussion soon about ch13. So there's a difference between catching, and then there's an additional issue of killing or squishing or trapping. Sometimes it could be simultaneous. Let's just read a little more, especially I know something here. So a gnat, you're not allowed to trap it. Interestingly enough, the Beis Yosef says if it's on your skin and it's biting you, maybe you could remove it, but you cannot kill it. You also shouldn't try to remove it with your hand because you might kill it. You should try to use your hand to just throw it off. Interestingly enough, he says maybe a louse, maybe you could. Here, an animal that kills, that's deadly, fatal. Vaday nargim b'Shabbos, you have to kill them. Even if they aren't chasing. Other animals which don't always kill, if they're chasing, you can kill them. You can trample on it deadly on these animals. Interesting. Okay. All right, there we go. So there's a little sampling of the discussion of trapping. Now, hold on, gotta load. Now we have a new Mishnah. An interesting Mishnah. Svi shenichnas labayis. As discussed, the last thing you want is a deer in your house. I've never experienced it, but I suspect it's something akin to a bull in a china closet. The deer is probably not going to be as delicate. I don't know if the deer takes off their shoes before stepping inside. I don't know if they have any kinds of courtesy to their host. And so Svi shenichnas labayis. But that's not our discussion here. Here we're not talking about how to avoid deer. V'nal echad b'fanav, and then somebody locked the door. So now the deer got in and it cannot get out. Chayev, the Mishnah says, one is liable. You've just trapped the deer. Now, what if na'alu shnayim? What if you have two people together trapping the door? Turim, they are pater. Now, this, of course, is a famous, long discussed matter called shnayim shasu. When two people do a malacha in partnership, you're pater. Except when sometimes it's very hard to put the lock. You have to push the door in and simultaneously move the lock. And in ancient times, in antiquity, we know that the locks were a whole lot more complicated. So if a person cannot handle the lock on their own, so now he has his friend help him. Chayavim, now we're both culpable for the act of trapping. Rashi, it came on its own. He locked it, by locking the door, the animal's trapped. Two is not. Then Rashi says, by the way, when it comes to locking the door, it is typical to need two people to do the lock. When you need two partners, when you need two members of the team, they are both chayiv. Rabbi Shimon says, no, one is not chayiv. Rabbi Shimon has a general rule. The darish kroi lemiftar. I don't know if you remember this. It was a long time ago and not so long at all. Rabbi Shimon has a much more lenient perspective, and he said it had to do with the psukim. Remember, we have three opinions. He says, he says when two people collaborate to do a malacha, even if they need each other, they are still pater because it's two individuals involved, not one. It had to do with the reading of the psukim that describe when a person commits a sin, a crime, and it said Dvar Pesha or something like that, and it told us that only one person doing it is chayev, two not. We're now going to see one of the shortest Gemaras on a Mishnah, just 3 lines. We might end just a few minutes early, but let's go. Amar Rav Yirmiyah Bar Abba, Amar Shmuel. We're talking about locking doors, locking cages, trapping animals. So the Gemara here adds an interesting halacha. Hatzad Ari b'Shabbos. If one traps a lion on Shabbos, Einoi Chayev Ad Sheyachnis Kseno Legor Zaki Shalom. One is only Chayev, it's only considered to have trapped an animal when you've got the animal into his narrow, specific cage. Rashi. Hatzad Ari. Afilu toivsoi. You think just because you grab the lion by the hind, you've got the animal in your custody? Ezut seidasoi. You've not trapped this lion. Shekishikoyis mashchis v'hoylech. When an animal is interested, it could continue to wreak havoc. You are actually probably in a lot of trouble. You think that you can wrap your arms around the lion and have it in your control. We're talking about a specific cage. Sounds like common sense, right? Until the lion is really in your custody, it's more likely that you are in the lion's custody than the lion is in yours. And so every animal has a different moment when we could say, now this animal's been subdued or contained. And for the lion, it's only at that point. And you may recall, we actually read this in the Rambam already when we were sampling the Rambam previously.
I have another question about this.
Hold on. Just okay, go ahead. Yes.
Are you allowed to save an animal's life? If you see an animal on the floor bleeding or hurting, are you allowed to like do something to it?
Good question. We've discussed previously when an animal is considered muksa, when you're allowed to handle it, when not. I don't want to give you a comprehensive answer now for the fear of of not being, how do you call it, comprehensive. But we can look it up. It's in the Shulchan Aruch about the laws of muksa and what kind of handling is permitted and what kind of handling is prohibited.
Thank you.
I think we're going to stop here just a few minutes early. And with Hashem's help, tomorrow we'll pick up a new Mishnah, Yashav Ha'echad al Pesach. And this is also an interesting question about if a human person with their body might be considered to have done the act of trapping. So let's just do a very fast recap. Today was an interesting Gemara. We spoke about animals that are sickly or weak. Is it considered trapping? And he said it depends what system is affected. It depends if the animal is restricted or not. That was essentially one discussion. We distinguished between an animal that has a fever and an animal that's literally unable to move. And then we talked about different kinds of insects. And we distinguished between those animals that are useful, those animals that are not useful, or typically trapped. We spoke about animals when they are we spoke about animals when they are paralyzed or when they're so vastly available, all of the halachic discussions. And then we talked about, again, the act of trapping an animal by locking the door. Although you didn't put it into your house, when you locked the door, you trapped it. What if two people are involved? Typically, the answer is you're chayiv, with the exception of Rabbi Shimon. And then we talked about a lion. That was today's Gemara. I hope you considered fruitful. Thank you all for being here today. Wish everyone a wonderful day. Look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow with good health and good circumstances. Yasher Koyach. Chumash will begin in just a few minutes at the same link. So you're welcome to join then. Thank you.